Welcome to another deep dive.
Listener, are you ready to go a little deeper than those campaign ads we're all tired of?
I know I am.
Today's deep dive is all about the 2024 election.
It is.
But we're not talking about the debates or the polls.
Yo.
We're talking about the legal battles that could decide it all.
That's right. You sent over this really interesting article from the Epoch Times about
right.
all the lawsuits popping up around the election.
And it's a lot to unpack.
It is.
So
Actually,
luckily, we've got expert speaker here to help us make sense of it all.
happy to be here. You know what I find fascinating about all these pre-election lawsuits?
What's that?
They're not just about this election.
They're not.
No way.
Mm.
This is about setting the rules for every election after this one, too.
Oh, wow.
The article really zeroes in on how these lawsuits are challenging the entire system.
Like how we vote.
Exactly.
Wow.
How those votes are counted.
Okay.
How the results become official.
So it's bigger than just one election.
Way bigger.
This is about the future of voting.
100%.
Okay, so I gotta ask.
Shoot.
This feels a little familiar.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Like 2020 all over again. Mail-in ballots, legal challenges.
Right.
The whole 9 yards.
Everyone's wondering the same thing. Is this 2020 2.0?
And what do you say? Is it?
Well,
Because I gotta say,
go on.
it's giving me deja vu.
It makes sense, you'd think.
A lot of the same themes are popping up again.
They are for sure mail-in ballots, voter registration, you name it.
Exactly.
But here's the catch. Even though we're hearing those echoes of 2020, the legal landscape has shifted.
Really, how so?
Well, there's this thing called the Purcell principle.
Okay, the what now?
The Purcell principle, it's a legal idea that basically makes courts hesitant to change election rules right before an election.
Oh, so like you can't just change the rules at the last minute.
Exactly.
Like you wouldn't change the rules of Monopoly right before someone's about to win.
Right. That's a good way to start a fight.
Exactly. And courts feel the same way about elections.
Yeah.
So because of this Purcell principle,
Right.
these lawsuits might not have as much power as they did in 2020.
That's the general idea.
Okay, so it's the same game,
Right.
different playbook,
I like that.
maybe even a different referee.
Well put.
So let's get into the weeds here.
Let's do it.
The article spends a lot of time on mail-in ballots.
Which makes sense.
They've been a huge point of contention.
For sure. And the article breaks down some really interesting examples.
Like what?
Like Pennsylvania.
Okay, what about it?
They had this case about the deadline for mail-in ballots
Uh-huh.
and something called ballot curing.
Ballot curing. What in the world is that?
Basically,
Because I've never heard of that.
it gives voters a chance to fix errors on their ballots after they've already mailed them in.
Oh, that's actually pretty cool.
It is.
So if you mess up your ballot,
Yeah,
you're not out of luck.
exactly. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court upheld this process.
So it's a win for voters.
It seems like it, right?
Yeah.
But it highlights this ongoing debate about election security versus voter access.
Right, because you want to make sure every vote counts.
Absolutely.
But you also don't want any funny business going on.
Exactly. It's a tough balance to strike.
It is, and it seems like every state's doing things a little differently.
That's the thing about the U.S. election system.
It's like 50 different elections happening at the same time.
That's a good way to put it, and those differences can have huge consequences.
They can, and speaking of different states, different rules, the article mentions that this is happening everywhere.
It really is.
Not just Pennsylvania.
Nevada and Mississippi are also wrestling with legal challenges around their mail-in ballot deadlines.
Gotcha, so similar issues there.
Similar, but with their own local flavor.
And what about Texas?
Oh, Texas always keeps things interesting.
The article mentioned something about a judge blocking part of their election law.
Yeah, so a federal judge blocked parts of a 2021 election law that critics said made it harder for people to get help with their mail-in ballots.
Oh, wow. So even helping voters is a legal battleground now.
It seems that way.
This is getting complicated.
And we're not even done yet.
What else is there?
The article also talks about lawsuits targeting overseas voters.
Overseas voters. Now, that's not something you hear about every day.
It's a fascinating twist.
It is.
The article specifically mentions Republican lawsuits in Michigan, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania that are challenging the validity of ballots from overseas citizens.
Interesting.
They're pushing for stricter verification processes for these ballots.
I can see both sides of that.
Right. It's tough because you want to make sure every legitimate vote is counted.
Yes.
But you also don't want to make it harder for citizens living abroad to exercise their right to vote.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance again.
Always about finding that balance.
Between access and security.
Exactly.
It's a tightrope walk, for sure.
It is. And it makes you wonder, It makes you wonder where we go from here.
Right. Because we've covered mail-in ballots.
We've talked about overseas voters.
But the article goes even deeper.
It does. It brings up this whole other battleground.
What's that?
Voter rolls.
Ooh, yeah, that's a big one.
It's not just about how people vote anymore. It's
Right.
about who gets to vote in the first place.
Exactly. And it sounds like that's getting more and more complicated.
Absolutely. The article highlights how states are trying to manage these lists of eligible voters,
Okay.
and it often leads to legal showdowns.
Give me an example.
We'll take the Justice Department lawsuits against Alabama and Virginia.
What happened there?
They were accused of trying to purge voters from their rolls.
Purge? What does that even mean?
Basically removing voters' names from the official lists.
And that's illegal.
It can be if it's done improperly or too close to an election.
Okay, so timing matters here.
It does big time. There's this thing called the quiet period.
Quiet period.
It sounds ominous.
It's actually a pretty straightforward idea.
Okay, tell me more.
It's basically a period of time before an election where certain changes to voter rolls are prohibited. So no last-minute shenanigans.
Exactly. It's designed to prevent voter disenfranchisement and chaos right before an election.
Makes sense. So you can't just kick people off the rolls right before they're supposed to vote.
Precisely. The DOJ argued that Alabama and Virginia violated this quiet period provision of the National Voter Registration Act.
And that's why they got sued.
You got it. It's all about protecting voters' rights and making sure the process is fair.
So it's not just about who's casting ballots, but who's even allowed to register in the first place.
Now you're getting it.
Yeah.
And this whole debate gets even more heated when you look at what's happening in Arizona.
Arizona, they've been in the news a lot lately.
For good reason, they've become ground zero for this battle over voter ID and citizenship proof requirements.
Right, I remember hearing something about that.
So Arizona passed a law requiring proof of citizenship to vote in presidential elections.
Okay.
And this triggered a whole legal battle.
What happened?
Well, a court case there led to over 100,000 voters being flagged.
Flagged for what?
For potentially not proving their citizenship.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
It is, and it raises these huge questions about voter suppression and disenfranchisement.
So how do you find that balance?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because you want to prevent fraud,
Of course.
but you also don't want to make it harder for eligible citizens to vote.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance, and Arizona has become a flashpoint for this very debate.
It's like walking a tightrope. And speaking of tightropes,
What's that?
even if we get past all of this, the mail-in ballots, the voter rolls,
Right.
there's still this whole other step,
What's
certification.
Yes, the often overlooked but crucial step of making election results official.
The article made it sound like even that's getting caught up in lawsuits.
Certification is becoming yet another battleground in the fight over election.
So tell me more about this certification thing.
Well, think of it like this.
Yeah.
Election day is like finishing a race.
Okay, I'm with you.
But certification is like crossing the finish line and getting your official time recorded.
So it's making it official.
Exactly. It's the process of verifying and confirming the vote totals.
And this is where things can get tricky.
They can, because states have different rules and procedures for certification.
And these rules are being challenged.
You bet.
Yeah.
The article points to Georgia as a prime example.
What's going on in Georgia?
They've got these new rules that allow for more scrutiny of election results before they can be certified.
So more checks and balances.
In a way, but these new rules have sparked a wave of lawsuits
From who?
from groups who argue that these rules could lead to delays and even potentially overturn legitimate election results.
Wow, so even if you win on election day, right, it's not over until it's certified.
That's the gist of it. Certification is the last hurdle, and it's becoming increasingly contentious.
This is getting intense.
Intense is one word for it.
So where do we go from here? With all this legal wrangling, could this election end up in the Supreme Court's lap?
That's the big question, right? Everyone remembers Bush v. Gore back in 2000.
Oh, yeah. That one kept us on the edge of our seats.
No kidding. And it really underlined how much power the Supreme Court has in election disputes.
So are we headed for a repeat performance?
Well, the experts seem to think that a direct Supreme Court decision on the 2024 election is unlikely.
Really?
That's what they're saying.
That's almost hard to believe with all the lawsuits flying around.
I know, right?
But they have weighed in on some election-related stuff this year, haven't they?
They have. Remember the whole debate about former President Trump and the 14th Amendment?
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
Huge. The court ruled that states can't just bar Trump from running based on their own interpretation of the Constitution's insurrection clause.
So Trump's back on the ballot.
Well, it's not quite that simple. The court left the door open for Congress to potentially take action.
So Congress could still step in.
It's a possibility. But for now, it seems like the Supreme Court is trying to avoid directly deciding the 2024 election.
Okay, so if the Supreme Court isn't going to be the referee in all of this, should we be worried? I mean, do all these lawsuits mean our elections are in trouble?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And here's the thing. Even if the Supreme Court doesn't get directly involved in deciding the winner, their stance on all these pre-election cases sets a powerful precedent.
What do you mean?
Think of it like this. Every ruling they make, every word they write, sends a message to lower courts and to lawmakers.
So even if they stay silent on the big picture, their decisions on the smaller details still have a ripple effect.
Absolutely. It's like they're drawing lines in the sand, even if they're not the ones calling the game.
So it's a delicate dance. The Supreme Court trying to stay above the fray, but their every move or lack of a move still has this huge impact on the whole election.
Exactly. And that's why we need to pay attention to these legal battles, even if they seem technical or procedural.
Because they're about more than just one election.
Way more. They're about the future of our democracy and how much faith we can have in our elections.
It's a lot to process. I feel like we just gave our listeners a crash course in election law.
Maybe we did. But hey, knowledge is power, right? The more we understand these legal battles, the more informed we are as voters.
Couldn't agree more. So to our listeners out there, as we get closer to November, remember that your vote is your voice. But it's also important to understand the rules of the game, those often invisible legal structures that shape our democracy. Stay curious, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay informed.
Well said. And on that note, thanks for having me. This has been a fascinating conversation.
The feeling is mutual. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.